Good morning, everyone. I'm Sonal Patel, Senior Editor at Power Magazine, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the inaugural Data Center Power Exchange. For 143 years, Power has covered the infrastructure that powers modern life, from policy and regulatory battles and to technology transformations and market restructuring. But what is unfolding over the last 2 years is categorically different. For decades after decades of growth, we started to document demand forecasts that weren't just rising, they were doubling. And by early 2024, that trend had crystallized into an industry-wide reckoning. And at the same time, in the power industry, we were seeing power system straining, transmission delays for stretching out for more than a decade, 4-year wait times for transformers and turbines, gas pipeline capacity falling short, and everywhere was the same fundamental question. Who pays for the infrastructure? How do we maintain reliability? What happens to ratepayers? And how do we secure community acceptance? So here's what became clear. Utilities and hyperscalers and regulators and financiers were each trying to solve the same problem, how to power the digital future without breaking the grid. But doing so in isolation from opposite sides of the table. And that's what DPX was built to change. We've been working with our excellent advisory board. We designed a summit around a simple premise to bring together the leaders and structure the conversation around the projects that they actually build. Today's agenda follows a life cycle framework from site selection. We're going to talk about the components and the fuel shortages and the line gaps and address location questions. We're going to talk about development, where permitting and financing determine project viability. We're going to talk about operations, where AI is transforming the grid and where it has potential to optimize our operations. And finally, to forward planning, where regulators and operators prepare for crisis, just in case the power does not show up. The goal isn't more conversation today. It is really about coordination. Each session will address a real bottleneck, and each speaker brings domain authority. I want to thank our advisory board and every one of our speakers, and who come from the federal and state regulatory space and utility executives. We have hyperscale executives here, we have developers, we have engineers and operators. Everyone who has stepped forward to make this dialogue, I'm truly grateful to you. I also want to thank our phenomenal DPX team, whose work over the past few months has made this vision come to life. And now, to open the day and ground us in the scale of the challenge ahead, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Mark Christie, former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Chairman Christie has spent his career at the intersection of reliability, regulation, and market design, and he has served nearly 17 years on the Virginia State Corporation Commission, led both the organization of PJM states and Mid-Atlantic Conference regulatory commissioners, and he has taught regulatory constitutional law for more than 2 decades. And he's also served as an officer in the Marine Corps. So please welcome Chairman Christie.
Well, thank you, Sonal, and I also want to echo her comments about the team that put this proceeding together, DPX25. Welcome to DPX25. I think this is the kickoff, and it's been extremely well organized. I've been really impressed working with Sonal and her team. Thanks to you all for coming out early in the morning. It's not early if you're on the East Coast, those of us on Eastern time, but if you're from California, this is really early. So thank you for coming out. The topic of my speech today is really comes down to a phrase that President Franklin Roosevelt used at the depth of the Depression in the 1930s with war clouds gathering in Europe. And President Roosevelt said, America is facing a rendezvous with destiny. And I would paraphrase that by saying today, when it comes to the electric grid, I think America is facing a rendezvous with reality. So what is the reality that we're going to have a rendezvous with, whether we like it or not? Because the thing about reality is you can run from reality for a while, but reality will track you down. And reality is tracking us down, and in two main areas. First, in terms of the reliability of the electric grid. You know, Americans expect, when Americans talk about reliability, what they mean is, I want power 24/7, 365. That's what Americans expect. You know, there are parts of the world, I've been to those parts of the world where sometimes the power's on the afternoon, maybe the power's on the afternoon 3 days a week, and people just accept that. Well, Americans don't accept that. Americans want power 24/7, 365. So we're facing a crisis in reliability. We're also facing another crisis, and that crisis is in rising customer power bills. EIA just came out yesterday and said that year-over-year prices increases in power bills for consumers was 6% over the last year. That's way over the rate of inflation. And if you look at the last 5 years, we've had more increases in power bills over the last 5 years than the previous 25. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it. But here's the point I want to make about the reality that's being faced. In 1848, Alexis de Tocqueville, after writing Democracy in America, he was then a parliamentarian in France. And he told his fellow members of the French Parliament in 1848, on the eve of the 1848 revolution, he said, "We are all sleeping on a volcano. I think rising power prices are a political volcano that's on the verge of exploding." So we have to keep in mind consumer costs, which really is, I think, a volcano about to explode. So what's happening on reliability? It really comes down to sort of a simple Econ 101. Econ 101, what do you look at? You look at supply and demand. On the supply side, over the last several years in America, we've been retiring prematurely too many dispatchable generating units, particularly coal. Now, I know some people don't like the word coal, but the reality is we have not been replacing coal with equivalent dispatchable generation. We simply have not been doing that. Certainly in RTOs like PJM, which depend upon the capacity market and energy markets to finance new generation. So on the supply side, we haven't been building enough new dispatchable generation. We've been retiring too much, prematurely retiring. So the supply side has been going in a wrong direction. At the same time, on the demand side, and many of you all today are very interested in this business, on the demand side, obviously we're all aware that the increase in load, largely driven by large load customers, hyperscale customers, has increased load forecasts, which in turn increases, for example, in PJM, the load forecasts become the demand curve, and the demand curve becomes the single biggest determinant of the prices in the PJM capacity market. And there's no coincidence that rising load forecasts equals rising prices in the PJM capacity market, which we've seen the last two times have hit all-time highs. So this is the two crises we face. We face a reliability problem from failure to build and replace a sufficient generation. And on the consumer cost side, we're facing what I think is going to be a political volcano if it isn't resolved, and that is the increases in consumer costs. Now, let me be clear about the load increases, because a lot of you guys are in the data center business, and I understand that. When I speak to audiences and I make these comments about data centers, and in Virginia, data centers have become a very big political issue. One thing I say is, how many of you are carrying one of these? And everybody, of course, is carrying one of these. I say, how many of you are carrying two of these? One business, one personal. And a lot of people are carrying two of these. I say, well, if you're carrying these, you're building data centers. So let's stop thinking that data centers came from Mars. Data centers enable us to live life online, which is what we do. We bank online, medical care online, sports betting online. That's key to a lot of people. So we live life online. So data centers are a fact of life. We need to serve that load. I'm a firm believer in the utility principle going back 125 years that all load must be served. Question, of course, is how do you serve it and how do you pay for it? So we need a ton of new generation. There's really no way around the reality that we're going to have to build a huge amount of new generation in America. And that really leads to three key questions. First question, how are we going to finance that new generation? Is it going to be rate-based mechanism? Is it going to be capacity markets? Is it going to be energy-only markets? CEG Texas? How are we going to finance all this new generation? And what is the best way to finance it? Second question it leads to, what is the role of states? After all, people on the 5 years I was on FERC, people would frequently say, well, what's FERC going to do to build generation? Why doesn't FERC just order more generation? Well, guess what? FERC doesn't order generation to be built. FERC doesn't permit generation with one small exception, and that's hydro. But FERC doesn't order generation to be built. Other than that, FERC regulates the markets, and it has a big effect. But it's the states that issue CPCNs for generation. It's the states that approve the integrated resource plans, the IRPs, that in non-RTO states certainly drive what gets built. And third question is, what is the best regulatory framework at the state level to get generation built and to serve reliability? Is it the quote-unquote deregulated model that we see in states like Maine and PJM? Or is it a vertically integrated model where generation can be financed through rate basing, as we see in states like Georgia, Florida, in the non-RTO states? So those are all questions that need to be asked. And of course, when we're talking about building out the generation that has to be built, how are the costs going to be allocated? Cost allocation is always a key question in utility regulation. How do you allocate the cost? Who pays? That's something every regulator, certainly at the state level, because that's where most of it's taking place. How do you allocate those costs? And how are we going to deal with the impact on reliability as we increase the load, largely driven by hyperscale users, which again, I'm a firm believer you have to serve all load. But what's the impact on reliability? If we interconnect large load without generation available, there's a small problem of physics. Load increases without generation, something's got to give. Something's got to give. So we got to balance the increasing load with providing supply of generation to service it. So these are the challenges we really face, I think, is the reality that we're facing, and I would say it's a dual crisis. On the reliability side, we have to build a lot more generation to serve the load that's already here, the load forecasts that are already driving, example in the PJM capacity market, already driving prices up. So we have to serve load. We've got to build generation. And of course, if you're building new generation and you're serving new load, you obviously have the costs of network upgrades as well. So I've even talked about the wires cost, which is a substantial part of that. And we have to do all this. We have to meet this challenge to keep the lights on. We have to do this while making sure that customers can actually afford to pay that monthly power bill, and that electricity doesn't become a luxury item that only a few can afford. Because if that day happens, I think the political explosion on that is just going to be breathtaking in its consequences. So we can't let it get to that point. Electricity has to be seen as it is a basic necessity of life. There may have been a day 50 years ago, 75 years ago, before rural electrification, when people lived without electricity. Not today. People expect it. So those are the key, I think, challenges that we face today. And in both of those, I think reality has tracked us down. Reality has tracked us down, and we're going to have to deal with the reality of both the reliability challenge and the consumer cost challenge, because you can't keep putting off reality. It will track you down, and it has. And with that, I'm now, okay. I'm going to move on, though, because those are the two main points I want to make. I'm going to move on and ask, we have two special guests today, and I'm going to ask the first one to come up. This person's uniquely suited to talk about these challenges, because Bob Blue is the chairman and CEO of Dominion Energy, Virginia, which, if you just arrived in America, Dominion is the utility for what I would call ground zero of the data center revolution. Not just ground zero in America, but I would say ground zero for the planet. There's more data center activity in Dominion zone in PJM than anywhere else, I would say, in the world. So I'm going to ask Bob Blue, Chairman and CEO of Dominion, to come up and give a few remarks. And thank you all for your attention. And after that, we'll have some questions and continue the discussion. But thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's quite a way to start your day with these kinds of topics, but they are very important, and I'm honored to be here with you this morning. I'm particularly pleased to be able, in a few minutes, to have a conversation with my friends Caroline Golin and Mark Christie. I particularly want to congratulate Mark as being selected the founding director of the new Center for Energy Law and Policy at William & Mary Law School. Congratulations, Mark. He may work at William & Mary, but he's a Demon Deacon, a Wake Forest Demon Deacon at heart. I don't know if he bet on that 13-12 game they won this past weekend. I'm guessing not, but I'm sure he was happy to see it. My experience with him as a regulator was it was always better to see him after Wake Forest had won a football game than after they lost one. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about the data center landscape in Virginia and the things Dominion Energy is doing to keep pace with its massive growth. Our mission is to deliver the reliable, affordable, increasingly clean energy that powers our customers every day. And data centers make up a large and growing share of our customer base. A decade ago, we were connecting 100 to 200 megawatts of data center capacity a year. Half a decade ago, we were connecting on average 600 megawatts of data capacity per year. For the last 3 years, we have connected about a gigawatt of data center capacity per year. So it's not just that data center load is growing, the rate of overall growth is increasing as well. Before I talk to you about what we're seeing on the data center growth front going forward, I want to level set on reliability and affordability. We're very proud of the reliability we offer our customers, 99.98%. Exclusive of major storms. We can never compromise on reliability. On affordability, our residential rates have long been below the national average and comparable to or below relevant regional averages. We've also been consistently below the overall rate of inflation for decades. For example, a Washington Post story this past weekend referenced a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab Brattle Group study which found rates in Virginia tracked below inflation from 2019 to 2025, even as growth has accelerated to record levels and the Commonwealth has become the home to the largest array of data centers on the planet. As the study noted, this was as fixed costs were spread over more load. As we navigate the growth I'm going to describe, maintaining affordability is crucial. To do so, companies like ours depend on a constructive regulatory climate so that we can attract the capital needed to serve this expected growth. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. This growth is not a new challenge. Our industry arose amidst the Industrial Revolution, and it dramatically expanded with the post-World War II economy and the baby boom. To jump to 2025, data centers now account for 27% of Dominion Energy Virginia's sales. Most of this is taking place in Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, where it's estimated that 70% of the world's internet traffic passes through. The data center market there is bigger than the next 5 US markets combined. That's the reality on the ground today. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with numbers, but we've seen the projected rate of growth in our PJM transmission zone grow rapidly as well. Back in 2021, PJM was projecting the rate of growth for our summer peak to be around 0.5%. Those projections have risen sharply. By 2023, the figure was 5%, or 10 times as much as 2 years before. And today, PJM is projecting 6.3% annual growth. We expect demand to double by 2039, driven in no small part by the expansion of the data center industry. These are projections, but we're seeing the growth happen in real time. Our top 10 all-time peaks in customer demand occurred this year, and 24 of our 25 all-time summer peaks have occurred in the last 2 years. All of this requires us to make some significant adjustments as well. To start with, we need an all-of-the-above energy policy. You'll sometimes hear politicians claim to support all of the above, but it often comes with an asterisk listing exceptions. We need all of the above, period. More natural gas, more solar, more wind, more storage, and even potentially more nuclear generation. That's the only way we can hope to meet rapidly rising demand. If you look at our latest long-term plan for Dominion Energy Virginia, it includes more than 33 gigawatts of new power generation over the next 20 years from all of the above sources. On the transmission side, we invested $2.1 billion last year, about 18% more than the year before. And we're looking at greater than $2.8 billion transmission capital spending starting in 2027. Because we need a way to get all of the new power to all of the new customers while ensuring costs are fairly allocated. The same Washington Post story I mentioned earlier also referenced the Browder Group's findings that data center growth has mitigated cost increases for our customers, not fueled them. Not surprisingly, to the extent utility costs are rising, it's because utilities are buying goods and services that cost more amidst economy-wide inflation that began with the COVID era and the fuel cost spike from the Russia-Ukraine war. In recent years, we've advanced electric transmission projects to bring both new and upgraded infrastructure to enable continued connection and expansion of data center customers in Loudoun County. That work has included reconductoring lines, expanding substation infrastructure, as well as building a 500 kV transmission line that we expect to complete by the end of this year. In addition, Virginia State Corporation Commission has approved another 500 kV line into eastern Loudoun County that we expect to have in service by the end of 2027. And last year, we announced an innovative joint venture with AEP and First Energy to propose several new electric transmission projects across multiple states, including new high-capacity transmission lines. The transmission investments mentioned above are all to serve the Northern Virginia market, but we're also developing transmission projects throughout Virginia. With all this needed investment, we're fortunate to operate as a vertically integrated utility in a regulated market. In our view, regulated markets are best for customers in any circumstance, but are particularly valuable at a time when our country needs to make major investments in the grid, including major investments in power generation to meet growing demand. I'm sure we'll talk more about this in a moment, but it's very difficult for deregulated market constructs to send the right price signal over a long enough period of time to incent new baseload generation. These projects take years to build. Of course, just any type of state regulation also won't work. As I noted earlier, a constructive model that allows utilities to earn a sufficient return and remain financially healthy is critical. Florida and Georgia provide excellent examples of cooperative models with constructive authorized returns on equity for their utilities to operate reliably and efficiently, thanks in part to a lower cost of capital, ultimately saving customers money. Specifically, with respect to large loads like data centers, we've adjusted our processes continuously since 2013. That includes adding a data center customer web portal to initiate service, exchange information, improve visibility for the customer, requiring deposits to accompany contracts to weed out speculative projects, putting sunset dates on the execution of contracts to ensure timely action by customers, employing cluster studies and a first-in, first-out queue philosophy. Given the size and density of requests in certain areas, it's more efficient to study capacity requests together as a cluster to ensure we look at the area holistically when identifying what upgrades are needed. This approach allows us to address upgrades that support several capacity requests while also reducing the risk of rework in engineering studies when we move from one capacity request to the next. And perhaps of greatest significance, we've proposed a new tariff for large load customers with high load factors or heavy energy users. Under our proposal, these customers will be required to pay minimum demand charges for distribution, transmission, and generation. In addition, new customers in this class would be subject to a minimum 14-year contract term and new deposit and credit requirements. The Virginia General Assembly's watchdog agency found that our data center customers are paying their fair share of costs today, and we believe our new proposal will help ensure they continue to pay their fair share for years to come, while protecting all customers from stranded costs. We look forward to a decision on our proposal from the SCC by the end of November. We're also encouraged by the growing recognition at both the state and federal level that the regulatory process for approving new projects could benefit from reform. Last month, Energy Secretary Chris Wright said building infrastructure is, quote, going to be massively easier than it has been in a long time. That's good to hear, because the data center industry moves very rapidly, and the regulatory process often moves slowly. The average length of time to get an environmental impact statement approved is 4.5 years. With the demand we're seeing, waiting for project approvals that long just won't do. Now, I know we have a full agenda I don't want to get in the way of, so I'll leave it there. The bottom line is we're seeing explosive growth in the data center industry and the demand for energy, and we're taking dramatic actions to make sure we can meet it. Thank you.
Let me introduce our newest guest here who's going to join us for a discussion, and I think we're going to have some time for Q&A. So if you want to have questions, we'll certainly entertain those. So Caroline Golin is the founding CEO of Envision Energy Advisors, formerly with Google. But I want to tell a personal story about Caroline. I first met her when she was an expert witness in a case in front of the Virginia State Corporation Commission. And I'd never met her before, and if you call that meeting, and because she came to the witness stand and was sworn in. But she was probably the single most effective expert witness that I saw in 17 years on the Virginia Commission. So that's saying a lot. So that's how I first met Caroline, was watching her in the witness stand after being sworn in and giving expert testimony. She was really outstanding. But I want to start with back with Bob and ask a follow-up question to one of the issues that you raised, Bob, and that is the regulatory structure for financing these needed assets. We know we're going to need a lot more generation. And so what is the best regulatory structure as you see it? And maybe be specific. So in Virginia, we still have and I would say, thank goodness, a vertically integrated, state-regulated construct, IRP driven, even though we're in PJM. We still have the IRP, so we're shielded from the capacity market, hedged against it to some extent. But Bob, do you think time has shown, this is going to be an easy question, do you think time has shown Virginia's model is actually a better model than those states that deregulated and are now fully exposed to the capacity market? And the big question is, what would you venture to say is the future of the PJM capacity market as a construct?
Yeah, I think the prediction on what the future of the PJM capacity market is, I'll leave it to people more expert than I am, but I'll say that
Well, you're pretty expert.
That a functioning market is one that you can move through quickly and sends the right signal over a long enough period of time. The capacity market in PJM is the name is actually the base residual auction. The residual word, I think, actually means something there. The auction, I don't believe, was intended, as originally envisioned, to be the sole way that load-serving entities would procure capacity. And so now we're in this instance, even within Virginia, where there are co-ops that have large loads and don't have a generation supply and are relying heavily on the capacity market. And as you pointed out in your remarks, and it is obvious to anyone who has taken Econ 101, if demand is going way up and supply isn't going up with it, then prices are going to go up. But there needs to be a signal long enough for someone to invest. And from our point of view, our experience in Virginia, and as you know, We don't think all the decisions of the Virginia regulators are perfect. I know that comes as a shock to you, and the Virginia regulators
I would agree with you.
don't always agree with what we propose. But that IRP model that requires us to plan out and then go to the commission for individual projects and explain how our proposals are going to work to serve our customers reliably. We think that's a very effective model. And so we're glad that we're hedged against the capacity prices in PJM. But in our view, a little more state direction within PJM, less reliance on just the base residual auction, and more for states that don't have a regulated model, more bilateral contracts, those kinds of things make more sense to us. So the bottom line answer to your question is, as described in my remarks, we think the regulated model works well. That said, we're very open to sort of creative ways of financing projects outside of just the traditional, the utility gets a CPCN, then raises the capital, and then builds. There can be partnerships, which we've done before. As you know, Mark, the North Anna Nuclear Power Station is partly owned by the Old Dominion Electric Cooperative. We operate a coal plant in Virginia that is partly owned by ODEC. So having partners in those projects, I think, can also be valuable. We've also taken on a financial partner in one of our largest projects, our offshore wind project. So I think within the regulated model, there can also be different constructs that can work to attract capital the right way to build what we need to build.
Let me just follow up on that while we're on that topic about the market approach versus a vertically integrated approach. So let me just ask you this, Bob. If you look at the history of PJM in the last 17, 20 years, and I've been involved in it, you've been involved in it, different perspectives. It seems to me, but I think facts back this up, so it doesn't seem to me like I'm making up facts. It seems like these are the facts. When Virginia went into PJM, it was 2004. I know because I sat on that case. And at the time, most of the states had surplus generation. Today in PJM is 13 states, by the way. And it is the largest RTO, largest grid operator by load in the United States, maybe one of the biggest in the world, if not the biggest. So it's important to talk about PJM. And it's also a laboratory about what works and what doesn't work. So today in PJM, of the 13 states in PJM, only 2 are not importing power. Only 2 have surplus power, Pennsylvania and West Virginia. We're importing in Virginia, but every other state except Pennsylvania and West Virginia is too. So my question then, Bob, as a follow-up, it seems to me, and I think the facts back this up, that what has happened in PJM, again, is the phenomenon that I mentioned in my earlier remarks. Dispatchable generation, particularly coal, has been retiring, and in PJM, with the exception of a vertically integrated state like Virginia, where when I was on the Virginia Commission, we approved 4 combined cycles for Dominion. The market in PJM, in those states that rely upon the capacity market, Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, it seems that large dispatchable generation, combined cycle gas, nukes, have simply not been incented or financed by that market. It seems like what we've gotten in the deregulated states that are depending entirely on the market has been combined combustion turbine peakers. We've got a lot of those. A lot of wind and solar because of the tax subsidies, obviously. And not discounting the value of any of those, but the core baseload generation that there's still a need for, we haven't moved away from that, has not been financed, seems to me, in the PJM capacity markets. What has been built in PJM has been in states like Virginia that were able to rate base and that kind of generation. So what's your reaction to that, Bob? It seems like in those states that are just leaning on the market for all their generation, we're getting a lot of peakers, but those aren't baseload generators. What we're not getting are combined cycle gas, and we're certainly not getting new nukes.
I think in the legal profession, that would be described as a leading question. And yeah, I mean, I think your question presumes the obvious answer, that the math is the math. There's less dispatchable baseload generation being built and a lot more renewables, which I think are important. I said in my opening remarks, we need all of the above. We need everything. But in recent years, you know, a lot of places in PJM, it has been much more on the renewable front and much less on the dispatchable front. We have in our integrated resource plan that we just filed over the course of the next 20 years, in addition to quite a bit of solar, 17 gigawatts of solar over a 20-year period. We also have 8.5 gigawatts of natural gas, several combined cycles, several peakers. We have a petition in front of the commission right now for natural gas peaking. The bottom line for the logic of the grid to operate effectively, in my estimation, is diversity, fuel diversity. The idea that we should go down only one path is a mistake. And so we need to sort of think about that, and the way the market has worked in the last few years within PJM, as you accurately described, it's really been leaning all in one direction. Mm-hmm. For us, we had the ability in this regulated model you described, as we were retiring coal, to replace it with natural gas and become much cleaner in the process, by the way. We reduced our carbon emissions 50% since 2005 as we've done that and remain reliable. We need to keep thinking about all those pieces as we move forward.
Carolyn, let me turn to you and sort of shift the topic, although if you want to comment on that back and forth, please do. But I want to ask you about the AI, and everybody knows what it stands for. It's not A1, it's AI. Certain cabinet secretary says A1. But it's artificial intelligence, which, you know, what I've read increases the power consumption of a data center by maybe 10, 15, 20x when you do AI. And that, of course, is increasing the load forecast, increasing the very issues that we've been talking about today, because load forecasts become demand curves, become consumer prices. Do you think it's a bubble? And if it is, are we going to overbuild?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And thank you all for having me here this morning. For close to a decade, I led Google's energy strategy in the US and globally. And about 3 years ago, we sat as a leadership team across all of our infrastructure group, and we started to look at what was coming down the pipe in terms of demand projections. And I'll be honest when I say the majority of us just didn't believe it. And I think I like to say, I think the majority of our utility partners just didn't believe it. We were sort of in a situation, the stages of grief, you know, like disbelief, fear, paralysis. You know, we've all sort of moved through that. And we didn't believe it largely because the data center industry have had sort of these erratic projections in the past. And we've seen these cycles of boom. And in large part, that's, as most of you all know, because our demand projections really chase a customer cycle, right? And about between 2 and 3 years ago, we started to see this huge uptake. I mean, the hockey stick, right? And I personally sat my team down, you know, hundreds of people in Google, and said, we're probably going to make some bad decisions over the next couple of years figuring this out. We need to be able to keep our focus and be able to see what is the forest through the trees. And as someone who, frankly, didn't really believe that this growth was real for the first year and a half, I now firmly believe it is real. But I think the question of whether or not this is a bubble is sort of the wrong question. I'm not an expert on technology. I don't believe every AI company will exist in a year. I don't believe every AI company should exist. I don't believe all AI applications have value, and that's the rate of churn, and that's what a technology revolution does, and that's the beautiful thing about what this country can produce. I do think that we're at this great watershed moment of reckoning that you talked about in the beginning, where this extreme growth, which I'd like to add is only the first wave of extreme growth we're going to see over the next decade in this country and globally, is sort of forcing us to figure out what type of system we want to build moving forward. And if we say it's a bubble, I think we will build to the same cycles we've been building to. We will use the same regulations we've been using. We'll use the same business models we've been using. We'll deploy the same technologies. I think if we say, what do we want the catalyst of these $350, $400 billion, which is the last estimate I've seen to flow into the US, of capital to do to our system, we'll treat it quite differently. So my general answer is it doesn't really matter. What matters is what we take with that capital and deploy onto the system. I generally think our grid, while reliable, is in massive need of a facelift. Dominion is not one of these, so I'm not going to throw you under the bus, Bob. But many of the utilities throughout the US have no idea where their load is. They actually have no idea how their distribution system is operating. They have no idea how to take load off their distribution system and redirect it to the transmission system. And that's because they really haven't had to. They've never had to deploy things like grid enhancing technologies or, what we call behind the meter or low-hanging fruit, battery storage, to try to non-wire alternatives, to try to think through solutions. They've never been forced to this space. And I think this is a great forcing function. I think if we step back and say, how do we want to use this capital? We could say, we're going to build a bunch of natural gas. I don't think we have the pipelines to do that personally, and I don't think we get the transformers in time to build what we need to see over the next 3 years. And I think that's an important point. The crunch is the next 3 years, and the crunch is the next 3 years because we're in an AI training race globally. If we don't meet the next 3 to 4 years of need, that training will go someplace else, or it will get beaten by other global actors that are just going to train their models through whatever means necessary. So we have this little arc. You can't build natural gas. You can't get the transformers. You can't build the poles and wires fast enough for the next 3 years. So we as a grid are going to have, and we can't build the wind and solar, frankly, fast enough for the next 3 years either. So we as a grid are going to have to figure out how we're going to do this. And that's going to come down to, I think, a lot of different business models than we've ever seen before. In the comment of, is it deregulated versus regulated? I think it's a matter of, do you get the market signals right? I think a regulated utility can do it just as well as anyone has said, if they're incentivized towards the right solutions. And I think Bob was talking about that in terms of partnerships and bringing up third-party capital. But it's also about incentivizing utilities to invest in the interoperability and the flexibility that this grid's going to need to manage this load. I think there's dozens of papers out there that says we have 50, 60, 70 gigawatts of latent capacity in the system, but we have no idea how to harness it. And that's in large part because we haven't had to, and in large part because we've never been incentivized to. So if we take all this capital that's being put in the system, and I think it is on the hyperscalers' responsibility to show up with part of that capital. I also think it's on the responsibility of a private equity to show up. I don't think it's the responsibility of residential customers to show up. Then we can transform the grid. And I think if we transform it well in this wave, we'll set it up for electric vehicle transport. We'll set it up for the continued electrification of industrial processing, and for what ultimately will become, a smart home future. All this AI is going to make everyone be able to track their data, use their data, engage in a way that we've never seen before. So we actually have to build a grid to do that. So I would say, use the money that's in front of us to build the grid we want to build, and set that grid up for the next decade of load that is coming, because it's not just AI. It's actually globally, the number one determinant of load growth continues to be residential air conditioning. If you actually look globally, there's not a single, even in Bob's backyard, there's not a single cloud market that's over 50% saturated in terms of customer acquisition. This is not going away. And it's not going to be done in 5 years. So how we build the grid today, how flexible we make it, how interoperable we make it, how smart we make it, is going to determine whether we do this well and whether we win this race. It's not going to be whether we build natural gas in time.
Well, let me follow up on that, if I could, as a regulator, and I guess as a lawyer, two negative qualities for a lot of people, but I want to see specifics. So when you say, let's take the money in front of us, first of all, where is that money? It's in consumers' pockets right now. Secondly, and let's build the grid we need. So what is that grid that we need? I mean, I look at things very simple, like we got to get generation because you got to put power on the grid. What is the grid we need when you say, let's take the money in front of us, which is right now in consumers' pockets, and let's build the grid we need?
Yeah, so I tend to think that the quickest way to get an electron on the transmission system is to take it off the distribution system. I also tend to think that there is a massive need for the concept of the prosumer between the utility and large load. The reality is large load came in and soaked up a lot of excess capacity, and then it sat there and didn't learn how to transition. Even us, I mean, Google is one of the largest deployers of clean energy in the world. We did not build a team on how to be a prosumer. Our goal was not to come in and say, how do you make the minimal amount of impact onto the grid that you can? How can you interconnect with the least amount of disruption to the distribution system or to rates? We were charged with how do you offset your footprint, right? So we were in charge to be an investor in clean energy, and that's what we built a workforce to do. Now what it seems needs to happen is you need to have a much different model between large load customer, utility, and regulator about how do you interconnect gigawatts of load with having the least amount of disruption for the rest of customers. There are the technologies to do that. There are the business models, incentives to do that. I don't think the regulatory community has advanced to that being the goal yet, but I think that they're getting there. So if you look at like the deployment of grid enhancing technologies, volt VAR, dynamic line rating, and storage, if you look at what PG&E and Maria has done over in Portland, and if you look at what the UK has done, they've said, how do we actually build the least amount over the next decade by optimizing the assets that we have? And the critical part here is, how do we incentivize and reward the utilities for that type of model? If the utilities are going to do the work to solve the problem, they need to be rewarded correctly, I think, in terms of their return on investment. But the investments can look very differently than they did before. So I think it's actually about asset optimization first, grid interoperability and awareness simultaneously, and then really putting it back on the large load to say, how are you going to work with us to solve this problem? I think if you're a passive large load customer, you can get interconnected in 10 years.
Well, there are a lot of large load customers that want, and just follow up one more time. Based on my experience, there are large load customers that are willing to curtail.
Yeah, yeah.
There are large load customers that do not want to curtail.
Yeah.
So how's the system operator, what kind of system is going to lead to where, okay, the large load customers that are happy to curtail, I think of crypto in Texas.
Right.
The large load customers that don't want to curtail, I think of your former employer, Google.
Yep.
Are you talking about price responsive demand? Are you talking about time of use price?
Yeah, no, it's a really,
yeah,
it's a good question.
What are you talking about?
It's a good question. So I think the reason why most hyperscalers don't want to be fit into a demand response bucket is because the cost of not training their chips is so demonstrative that there's no price signal that's actually going to force them to curtail. So it's a different model. It's about actually taking responsibility for certain hours during the year. So that to me looks like more like on-site storage and maybe on-site gas in order to do like a ride through. There are, however, several edge providers right now who are building storage into the way that they interconnect. That I think is a brilliant model, and I think will be the future of the way data centers are built. I think what a lot of people don't recognize is the majority of the specs for technical specs for data centers, particularly on the hyperscale side, are approved years and years and years before we even go to market. And adding something like the ability to flex up and down is just technically not feasible. So then the question is, well, what are we going to place either nodally to prevent those swings, or behind the meter to allow for that type of ride through? I think that's completely reasonable, and that's something I think that most are trying to build to. I think it's just going to take time. But I would also say that if you're going to be flexible and bring that flexibility, then the regulators have to accredit that resource. And what we've seen over and over again, and and I saw this personally, a willingness to bring an opportunity for flexibility and an unwillingness for the market to accredit that resource. In which case, why would you do it? If you're not going to, if it's actually a financial disincentive compared to the cost of not training, and you're not going to get resource accreditation so that you can actually grow into your load quicker.
Yeah. I'm going to turn and ask Bob a question, but before I do, I want to just say, after I ask Bob this question, I'm going to give opportunity for anyone who wants to ask a question from the floor. So if you've got one, get ready and shoot your hand up. I don't see any mics around here, but you can just shout it out and we'll go to you. Bob, let's turn to nukes. As we look at the future and we talk about the need for new generation, Virginia's running 4 nuclear units. Thank God that you are. They were there for peak, and nukes run at a 90% plus capacity factor, which is extraordinarily important, extraordinarily valuable. Carbon-free, for those who put a priority on that. So what's the future of nukes, and how are we going to finance them, and is it realistic? We know what Southern paid for Vogtle. What about SMRs? What do you see as the future of nukes?
Well, let's start with keeping the units that we've got operating.
Amen.
And I think that is sometimes lost as people think about the next thing.
Right.
So our plants are now in Virginia are now licensed out to 80 years. So North Anna and Surrey were the first two in the country to get those license extensions. We operate a unit in South Carolina that has also been extended, and then we have 2 units in Connecticut where we certainly hope that we'll be able to do that. So let's keep those running. And then it really is, in my estimation, a risk and financing issue. As you pointed out, the 2 units built in Georgia were pretty expensive. We own a utility in South Carolina because they went down the path of trying to build new nuclear units, and they got in financial distress. Right. And we ended up merging with them as sort of coming out of that. So we're quite attuned to this risk issue. So at a utility return, taking the kind of risk that is associated, putting that risk on our customers and our shareholders, pretty challenging. But we have, for example, entered into an MOU with Amazon for the possibility of a small modular reactor at our North Anna site, where we operate 2 units today. They've expressed some interest in helping finance a new nuclear unit. We haven't moved beyond that MOU stage at this point, but we continue the conversations. But that's really, in my mind, what it's going to have to come down to is how are we going to figure out a way to finance these projects and to take the risk associated with cost overruns. We do not have a muscle memory in this country for building nuclear. And until investors have confidence in our ability to bring them in on time and on budget, that's going to be a challenge. I know there was an announcement from the administration today, a deal they've entered into with Cameco and Westinghouse. That's certainly very intriguing, may be a very important step in moving the ball. We'll have to see. I just read the press release before we got here this morning, so I don't know the details. There's an incredible amount of energy around new nuclear from the hyperscale customers. And then finally, I'd add, Mark, as you know, we're in Virginia. I think that's probably the most pro-nuclear state in the country. We've got the nuclear navy, we've got huge parts of the nuclear supply chain, and we've got our 4 units that have been operating well. We just got to figure out that finance and risk model going forward. There's a lot of policy support out there, policy maker support for new nuclear, for all the reasons you described.
Yeah. Let me give the floor an opportunity. We got just a few minutes left. That one has a question? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah.
If you could please wait for the mic. Thanks.
He's bringing you a mic.
Hi, Stuart Pomeroy with Paces. Thank you for all of your comments. Question about the return mechanisms for a utility in the era that Caroline described. So utilities are incented to invest in net new megawatts, CapEx, and infrastructure, right? Caroline, you almost proposed that they need to be incentivized to invest in negative megawatts or negative CapEx, avoidance of new build out. Mark, what is allowed? What does that new structure maybe look like?
Well, this is one where one of my favorite phrases, the devil's in the details. I mean, if you're talking about return on equity, return on a capital investment, if you're in a rate case and let's say Dominion's come in and proposed a combined cycle unit, which they proposed 4 to us when I was on the Virginia Commission. We approved every one because we thought the facts showed it was A, needed, and B, the cost was prudent. And that cost calculation included the ROE. That's obviously part of it. At the same time, we had numerous applications for what people like to call the negawatts or the DR or the DSM. It comes under different acronyms at different times. But it's all about incenting people not to use electricity, whether you call it DR, DSM, whatever. And I will tell you, it all comes down to the facts. There were a lot of programs that were proposed that actually saved people money. I mean the whole customer base. There were others that were proposed that only saved the person who used it. Like, here's a coupon to go get a new refrigerator. Well, everybody else pays for the coupon. And what do they do with the old refrigerator? They put it in the garage and keep the beer in it. So, it really is a fact-based inquiry. And Caroline talked about GETS, and I'll give you a chance to talk about GETS. What engineers have told me about GETS is some work, some don't. So, when FERC was asked to mandate GETS, my question was, well, the engineers say some of them work, but some of them don't. So why is FERC going to say you have to use GETS as a category? But I'm Caroline Golin.
So I think generally just the basic understanding that utilities make a return on investment of capital. They don't make it a return on the sale of electrons in a regulated model. What I'd love to see a conversation around is how we can incentivize through increased basis points on return through the sale of electrons as opposed to the investment on capital. Because you can sell a lot of electrons by investing in low capital solutions. But the utilities don't get a return if they sell more electrons. They get a return if they invest more capital. But the entities that are coming online will pay a very large premium for quick electrons. So there is a balance sheet there that needs to be assessed. And I think if we were to do that well, and it can be isolated. I don't know if you need to blow up the entire system. We may want to. But it can be an isolated model that I think is ring-fenced and really, really works for speed. Because right now, a CapEx deployment model doesn't work for speed. In terms of GETS, of course, not everything works. But I think that the problem generally with our system is we say, we're going to make a monolith, as opposed to say, let's study this node, move it out, move it out, move it out, and build up. That's a problem within PJM right now.
Yeah.
And I think if you see the isolated places where we have studied the importance and the deployment of these new technologies, they tend to work. I think when you just say peanut butter it across the entire system, no one even knows the data how to do that. And most of these data systems don't even talk to each other. And we don't actually have the workworkforce to do it yet. Yeah.
Let me go to Bob for the last word.
Something.
Yeah, I would just note we're investing in all these things. So
Yeah,
we're working on dynamic line ratings. We're working on GETS. We're adding new generation. We're building traditional, high voltage transmission lines. We've proposed in the latest PJM open window an HVDC line. So the demand is driving, my view is the demand is driving exactly what I described earlier, is an investment in everything because we need to. Mm-hmm. To the extent that we are not moving as quickly as some might suggest on some of these new technologies, this is not a machine you can break. As Mark pointed out at the beginning, our customers expect their power to be on all the time. So we can't like experiment and say, well, it didn't quite work out. Sorry, you're going to be off for the next few days while we undo what we did. We have to make sure we don't move fast and break things. We move quickly and keep things operating well, because we're entrusted with a machine, the most important machine in my view, in the history of civilization. We need to make sure it works for everybody.
Well, listen, I think we're out of time. Thanks these two for coming up here and engaging this dialogue, and I hope you all enjoyed that. So thank you all very much. And I wish we had another hour, because we could go another hour, but we don't. So all back to you.